To the end of the summer, I was just about ready to get to zero. I said, Lord, I'm doing my part, but as I'm calculating my expenses, my last paycheck will get me to within $60 of paying off my debt.
And I wasn't necessarily putting them to the test, but I just wanted to be faithful to see how it was going to work.
God is a rewarder of faithfulness.
Welcome back to our series entitled Your Faithfulness Rewarded. You will remember from our previous session that we looked at the biblical principles of tithing. We learned three things from our study. Number one, the tithe doesn't belong to us. It's the Lord's. It is holy. Number two, we are to follow God's plan precisely in how we return our tithe. It is not up to us to decide where the tithe goes. Malachi tells us to bring all the tithe into the storehouse. And number three, the tithe is to be used as God directed to support the ministry of His work and His mission. Today we're going to look at how the Seventh-day Adventist Church has taken these biblical principles of tithing and applied them into our church setting by establishing the conference as the storehouse for all the tithes and offerings to be returned to. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was born out of the Great Disappointment. William Miller and others had preached and taught that Jesus' soon coming would be on October 22, 1844. They were disappointed when Jesus did not return on that date. Many lost their faith in the imminent return of Jesus. Still others continued to study the Scriptures and made some fascinating discoveries. They learned from their studies that the cleansing of the sanctuary referred to in Daniel 8, verse 14, was not the cleansing of the earthly sanctuary, but the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary. Hiram Edson had a vision in which he saw heaven open to his view, and he distinctly saw that instead of our high priest, Jesus, coming out of the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary, and then returning to earth, he saw him instead entering into the second compartment, into the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. He had a work to perform in the most holy place before returning to earth. They also learned the truth about the Sabbath of the Old Testament, and that God had never changed the day. It is still the holy day that God had set aside at creation. Rachel Oakes Preston introduced the Sabbath to these early Adventists. Frederick Wheeler, a local Methodist preacher, began keeping the Seventh-day Sabbath, and his church in Washington, New Hampshire, became the first Seventh-day Adventist church. With these new truths they were learning, they wanted to share this information through the printed word. As more and more people learned of these truths, churches began to gather, members became to gather into organized churches all across the Northeast and into Michigan. In April of 1861, a small group of leaders convened in Battle Creek, Michigan, to prepare for the incorporation of the newly formed Publishing Association. The biggest issue that these new believers were having was whether or not to organize as a denomination. They were finding the need to organize to hold ownership of their printing press. There were considerable oppositions to organizing as a denomination because they were fearful of organized religions. Many of them were in an organized religion before they became part of the Millerite movement and looking for Christ's soon return. And many of them were taken out of those denominations. Much study was done and a document entitled Organization was produced. It set forth the basic principles that have guided the church ever since. The writers of the document proposed three things. One, a more thorough organization for the local churches. Number two, a proper organization of state or district conferences, which should grant ministerial credentials. And three, holding of general conferences that would represent the will of these newfound and new formed churches. At the state level, the conference would authorize the license of ministers to preach, the payment of the ministers holding title to church properties, and to receive the tithe. In October of 1861, the Michigan Conference was the first conference to be organized. One of their first items of business was to arrange for a fixed salary for the ministers. Funding came from the members via the churches that were part of this new conference. These actions of this first conference had the practical effect of making the conference the storehouse. In Testimonies to Ministers, page 26, Ellen White writes, "As our numbers increased, it was evident that without some form of organization, there would be great confusion, and the work would not be carried forward successfully. To provide for the support of the ministry, for carrying the work in new fields, for protecting both the churches and the ministry, for holding church property, for the publication of the truth through the press, and for many other objects, organization was indispensable. System and order are manifest in all the works of God throughout the universe. Order is the law of heaven, and it should be the law of God's people on the earth." 2 years later, on May 21, 1863, the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists was formed, and the movement became an official organization. In 1878, the General Conference recommended that the conferences pay a tithe on the tithe they received to the General Conference. Before this, the General Conference was funded by irregular appropriations from the conferences. In 1901, when the union conferences were organized, the conferences paid a tithe of their income to the unions, which in turn paid a tithe to the General Conference. This is the system that we follow today. Churches join together to form a conference that serves their needs as a legally recognized body to hire and supervise the ministry, to pay the ministers' salaries, and to collect tithes and offerings from the churches to fund evangelistic endeavors. One of the many questions I get as the treasurer of the conference is, where does the tithe go? When I return it in the tithe envelope in my local church, where does it go? So we have prepared a pie chart here which shows the distribution of the tithe. And so it goes as such. The North American Division and General Conference receive 15% of the tithe. The Southwestern Union Conference, our union for our territory here in Texas, receives 9% of the tithe. The Retirement Office for our workers receives 11% of the tithe. Southwestern Adventist University, our university here in Keene, Texas, receives 4% of the tithe. So as you can see, 40% of the tithe it leaves the conference. It goes to other ministries, other entities above the conference. And so the conference is left with 60% of the tithe in which to work and do the activities for our church here. 41% of that tithe is used for church ministry, and this includes many departments of the conference, those ministry departments that affect the local church. For example, children's ministries, men's ministries, women's ministries, evangelism, youth, and our Lake Whitney Ranch. It also, part of that is the pastor's salaries and benefits makes up the 41%. For education, 11% of the tithe is used to fund a portion of the teacher's salaries. In the services section, which is 3% of the tithe, and this represents our auditing department, our IT department, communications, and our publishing department is all part of the 3%. And then 5% of the tithe is used for administration, the operation of the conference office here, the offices of the officers, president, secretary, treasury departments, human resources department, and the trust plan giving and trust services department are all funded by 5% of the tithe. So with that tithe, the 60% that the conference uses, and these are some of the reasons that a conference has been organized, as we've discovered in our earlier. One of the purposes of the conference is to organize churches, and to hire pastors, and to organize schools, and hiring of teachers, evangelism, and the training of members. Many of our churches, again, have church schools, and so when one church, maybe that's too big of an activity for one church, and so maybe several churches come together and says, we need an elementary school, or we need an academy, and so they work together to make that happen. And so that's what conferences are all about, is pulling our resources together to do something bigger than what we can do by ourselves or individually. So some of the organizations that are part of the Texas Conference, we have over 300 churches and companies that are sister organizations in the conference. We have 18 elementary and junior academies. We have 5 academies. We have one brand new academy that will be starting this fall in Houston. Lake Whitney Ranch, which is our facility for our summer camp and retreat center. The Adventist Book Center is part of one of the organizations of the conference, as well as our Adventist Community Service Center, which serves our communities in our churches by supplying food and clothing in emergencies and helping in disaster response when those things strike. Some of the purposes of the Union, the Southwestern Union, which is located in Burleson, Texas. Some of the activities that the Union does that conferences don't, and again, how we share resources and activities in different areas. Religious liberty is one focus of the Union. When a person has difficulties with their job over Sabbath issues, they have resources that can help people in those situations. The revolving fund, which serves as a place where our churches and schools can borrow funds for building churches, for buying churches, for renovating churches. The education department, which oversees our schools and our practices as a conference. The Southwestern Union Conference Record, which is a communication piece that communicates to all members things that are going on within the Southwestern Union. Of course, evangelism is a key piece, as we'll see in each of these organizations. Evangelism is our mission. It's our purpose for the movement of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And then Southwestern Adventist University is the responsibility, comes under the responsibility of the Union. Some of the purposes of a division, and our division is called the North American Division. Their office is in Columbia, Maryland. They have media ministries, whether radio or television. So those are sponsored by the division. Seminary, where our pastors go to be trained at Andrews University. Sabbath school resources are developed at the division level. Our children's Sabbath school, our adult quarterlies are all developed there, written there. The retirement plan is managed at the division. So our employees' retirement benefits are managed. Evangelism, again, another key component of divisions, of what they do to help facilitate evangelism and spreading the gospel around the world. And our publishing house, the Pacific Press in Idaho, is one of the entities of the division that oversees the printed word, our books, our magazines. Many of them are printed in our own publishing house. Some of the purposes of the General Conference. The General Conference is the world headquarters for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is located in Silver Spring, Maryland. One of their main purposes is sending out missionaries around the world to serve and to teach others about Christ. Evangelism, again, a component of our worldwide movement. Adventist World Radio, Adventist Development Relief Agency, ADRA, Global Mission, the Adventist Review, again, the communication piece that tells of the world news, things that are going around in our denomination around the world. And in fact, there are 13 worldwide divisions that make up the General Conference. And each one of those are into a specific area of the world and how they oversee those actions. Our giving system is not just about tithe. And so part of our giving process through the tithe envelope, there is a section there for the local giving. And so local giving is how our churches operate. Since none of the tithe stays at the local church, offerings are needed in which to operate. And so many churches have a church budget where it's all given to church budget, and then those funds are allocated to different ministries. They could have a church school, evangelism, personal ministries, Sabbath school departments, pathfinders and adventurers, utilities, and the mortgage or the rent payment is all cared for from the local church budget, the local offerings. The conference giving section on the tithe envelope, we call that Texas Vision, and that's the name of our local offering that's collected once per month. And Texas Vision is used for education, 25% for education, 25% for building fund, which helps churches with appropriations, churches and schools to help with their buildings. The development at Lake Whitney Ranch receives 25% of that offering, and evangelism of 25% is split between English and Spanish evangelism. Next segment on the tithe envelope is the world giving. So not only are we a local church where we meet the local needs, we meet the conference needs, but we also have a system that we meet the world needs. And so world giving is the biggest portion of that is through the Sabbath school offering, the weekly Sabbath school, the 13th Sabbath, the birthday thank, annual sacrifice. These are all ways of generating funds for missions. And so these funds are all dedicated to overseas missions, and they're also dedicated to missions here in the North American Division. The Texas Conference will be receiving some funds in 2021 from part of the investment offering that will be taken. And so many different areas are covered by the world budget. Our universities receive a portion of the world budget. Our education systems receive that. Our television and radio ministries, ADRA, and different areas, Adventist World Radio, Christian Record, Adventist Community Services, and again, our large educational institutions, Andrews University, Loma Linda University, Oakwood University, all receive a portion of the world budget. Many churches, again, have special projects, conferences have special projects, and those are also listed on the tithe envelope in order for people to give. So if you ever have questions about where the tithe goes or where your local offering goes, always check with your local treasurer. If they can help you with that, and as the different levels above that, obviously we each have it spread out in a different way, and more than happy to share that information with you. And just want to encourage you as we will meet for our next session, and we will start on those 7 financial principles, those 7 biblical financial principles that we're going to look at. And the principle number 1, which will be our next session, is since God created me and sustains my life, everything I have is really His. And so we will be exploring that principle with our next time together. Let's bow our heads for prayer. Father in heaven, again, we thank you for the wisdom that you gave our early church founders of how to fund this world church, not a congregational church that just deals with the needs of the local church, but a system that expands across this world. And Lord, the wisdom of that and how you've guided that process, and you continue to guide that process even today. The more than 20 million members who make up this world church that started with such a small little group. but yet it's expanded in your eyes, and your mission in this movement to tell others about Jesus' soon return. Lord, bless us and keep us, and may we always look up to you and put our trust in you. In Jesus' name I pray.